Hi, and welcome back to the Church Renewal podcast. I'm your host, Allan, and today on the show, we've got Flourish's Executive Director, Matt Bowling, and we are wrapping up Season 2 of the podcast. We've spent the last couple weeks talking about the building blocks of church renewal, strategic planning, and the church life cycle, and the importance of the gospel for the pastor, as well as having great conversations with folks engaged in the work of church renewal across the country. Today, to wrap up Season 2, we're going to talk about the courage to lead change in the local church. And so, join us as we dig into the ways that Jesus is renewing his church. All right, Matt, welcome back to the podcast. How are you?
I'm doing okay today.
Yeah?
Yeah, finishing up some stuff for my doctorate. We'll get that out on the blog. People will be able to see that in the next couple of weeks. It'll probably be driving out by the time this comes out. But anyways, should be good. Stuff on time use and emotional budgeting.
Mm-hmm. As folks are listening to this podcast, it'll be getting close to the end of the year. Thanksgiving's just around the corner. And so do you have big Turkey Day plans?
Actually going to visit family in New York. Haven't been back to for Thanksgiving in New York in quite a while. So that'll be fun.
Nice. Coming to the East Coast. Bringing the whole brood. Everyone's coming out?
The whole brood, man. The real deal.
Great. We're going down to Nashville. My brother-in-law just moved down that way. And so, yeah, we're going to go down and visit family in Nashville. We're looking forward to it.
Little tryptophan.
That's right. Right. So today we're talking about leading change. You know, we do a workshop on this topic, leading change. And at the very top of our note-taking sheet that we give our participants, we have a little quotation. I think it's from you, but you might have gotten it from someone else. I don't remember, but I'm going to ask you to talk about it. It says this: let's get one thing clear. If you don't display courage in the way you manage your ministry, it will wreck your ministry. Is that a Matt Bowling quote?
That's a Matt Bowling quote.
It's a Matt Bowling quote.
It's a Matt Bowling quote. It's built off of a Don Ross quote. Don Ross is the district superintendent, conference superintendent, something like that, in my area for the Assemblies of God. And he wrote a book called Turnaround Pastor that's actually quite good. That's the recounting of his story of the Lord using him in the turnaround of a local church here. And he has a lot to say about courage in his book. So maybe we'll link to that in the podcast notes. But I think that the journey around courage, the reason that this became important to me as well, it but it did really impact my ministry here in Seattle, that in the beginning of it, I didn't display courage. And so I saw the consequences of me being a weenie, and now I'm a repenting weenie. And
a repenting weenie. I just see like the Oscar Mayer Wienermobile, like trying to make a U-turn.
I repent of driving that car.
Okay, I mean, so you're a repenting weenie. Okay.
I'm a repenting weenie. Yeah. I mean, I think that there are hard things to face, particularly in church renewal. And we hesitate to because it doesn't feel very pastoral, right? To confront difficult people or ministries that need to be shut down or dynamics that need to change or people that have outsized power. We hesitate to move towards any of those things. And yet the church can't be healthy. They're the very things that are blocking the vitality of the church. If we don't move towards them, then we can't help the church become vital and fruitful again.
Yeah, I've heard you say that the renewal and revitalization of local churches is more than, but it is not less than, a series of staged conflicts. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, look at the New Testament. Look at the way that the Apostle Paul, or for that matter, writing the Hebrews, or Jesus in the first couple of chapters in Revelation 2 and 3. What are all those? All of those are confrontations of local churches that got off the path in some significant enough way that the apostle felt like they needed to be addressed, or Savior himself, right? And so those are examples. I mean, you look at Corinth, and there's multiple examples. Mark Dever's got a book that's 12 different things that were going on in Corinth, right, that needed to be confronted. And so I think that the wise renewal pastor is looking at that that kind of diagnostic that the New Testament gives us and says, what are the things that need to be addressed in my local church, and move towards them with courage and love.
Yeah. Yeah. So components of leading change, there's a lot of literature out there on how to lead change in a local church. And that's what we're talking about. When we're talking about leading renewal, we're talking about um, leading some fundamental change in the way things are going in the church, right? Every Christian needs to be constantly renewed in their thinking. That's the process of sanctification. Every group of Christians need to be uh, therefore also being renewed according to the word. Um, and so key components that we talk about in our training on leading change are urgency, clarity, and communication. What does it mean? What does it mean for a church to have a sense of urgency that things can't or shouldn't stay the same?
Yeah, I think you meant urgency, clarity, and courage, but we'll get there.
Oh
Communication is
yeah,
important too. That's
communication
all
is
right.
important too, and then other c words like carrots and and
Cavorting, cavorting.
and cavorting, right? All of these things are key components of leading
You got to have
change.
fun at it too, right?
Let's start
So
with urgency.
urgency. So urgency. Yeah, I mean, in John Cotter's classic book on leading change, the first mistake he says that people make is that they have good ways that the environment needs to be different and change, but they don't ensure that first there's sufficient urgency. Um, and without sufficient urgency, there's not enough motivation for change, right? So, um, what is it? Who's the author that says, um, unless the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of change, then we won't change. So, how does urgency come about? One of our friends of the ministry says that it can come about because of a light bulb. People's thinking has changed because of love. Their love for God has changed because of, or because of pain, right?
Sure.
Pressing
Well,
on thinking heart or will can be any of those that can bring about a change in urgency.
yeah.
What do you say? Sorry.
I was just going to say, as we look at the world around us, I think a lot of folks feel like things are just constantly changing and that it's the role of the church to preserve the truth, preserve the faith. So when we talk about an urgency for change, I don't think we're talking about the way the culture just seems to change on a whim around us. But what are we talking? What are you talking about, Matt? Are you talking about updating your music so people like you? What do you mean when you say churches need to have an urgency for change?
I think there are a couple of things. One is churches. We were just talking. We were just on a call with a client last night. Churches lose their focus on the Great Commission
Mm,
because it's very other centered, and we tend toward self centered, right? So we tend to pick what's comfortable and easy that fits within our American dream lifestyles, and so some of it is that we we just end up off track of what Jesus would have us be about, right? And that's the easiest thing to do. So, and then I think the other thing is that as we go about the fulfilling of the Great Commission, it's a missionary adventure, right? We're missionary detectives. We're constantly looking and seeing and trying to figure out how should we go about the work that we're doing right now. And certainly in 2020 with COVID, and certainly as the culture changes, right? Our approach actually should change. The Bible doesn't change, the message doesn't change, right? But the way that we go about talking about it, the things that we um, believe are worthy of addressing now
mhm.
are different because culture is different and people's perspectives have changed. And so there's unique opportunities now for the gospel. And so while the function of things doesn't change, the form certainly should.
Sure. Sure. So the second piece then is clarity. And I think that we're kind of getting into that. I think it's important, and I think this is where communication came from in my head. But but it's important for church leaders to clearly say to their congregations, this is who Jesus calls us to be. So we need to go be this. What is the role of clarity from your perspective, Matt, in leading change in a local church?
So I talk about a lot of times when I do this as a seminar, I talk about the process of getting from the airport where I landed in the plane to getting to the place where I'm talking to people.
Mm-hmm.
And one time on our honeymoon, my wife and I were in Panama, and we were in central Panama. And my friend, whose family we had seen and who told us about this particular place that we were going, told us, "Well, on your way to this beautiful B&B, run by some expats, um, he said you should visit this waterfall." And we were like, "Okay." And he says, "Well, you'll know when it's time to turn at the waterfall because there'll be a cow on the corner in the field." And we're like, "That's the directions?" He goes, "Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's always a cow on that corner in the field." It was the craziest set of directions we ever followed. Amazingly, we found somebody with with enough English proficiency or our halting Spanish managed to get it done that we actually found the corner with the cow and found the waterfall. Lost my first wedding ring there, but that's the story for another time. Anyways, but that is an example of a lack of clarity in where you're going. Most of the time when I drop into an airport and I've got an address where I'm going to, I just stick it in Waze on my phone and put it in the holder in the car and go, right? And what does that give me? It gives me a destination and a roadmap of how to get
Mm-hmm.
there, right? And for a church, that kind of clarity, a destination and a roadmap, right, are the kinds of things that are important. If a church doesn't have a distinctive idea of who God's calling them to be and how they, in particular, should be going about fulfilling the Great Commission. That's a different way of just uh, collecting the ideas around the idea of vision, right? You don't have
Mm-hmm.
clarity about how God would have us distinctively be involved in fulfilling the Great Commission. It's very hard to get there. It's also very hard to make decisions, right? It's hard to decide, should this particular strategy be utilized or should this other one, right?
Yeah.
Is this a good choice for us or is this not a good choice for us? It's very hard without that sort of clarity.
Yeah. Can you give me an example or a story about a church that suffered because of their lack of clarity?
Yeah, I would say there's a client that we've worked with here in the Pacific Northwest where they started with a very distinctive focus on a part of a big city. And over time, the church planter moved on to other work. The people who had originally been a part of the church and involved in that part of the city largely departed. And by the time that we got to working with the church, it was very diffuse. The ministry was very diffuse. The people were drawn from a large geography, kind of all over the city, and they did not have any sort of center that held not only geographically but also sort of why do we exist. And it was very hard actually to try and help them find some kind of center again because they had lost it. And so yeah, it's hard to decide what's in and what's out when you don't have any clarity.
Right. Right. Um, I can remember being a young buck pastor thinking, I know exactly what we need to do. So kind of running around telling my church, we need to change, we need to change, we need to change. And never saying, here's where we're going. Like ever. Like I don't think I ever like painted a picture or like gave people like a clear picture of what I thought we, again, it's probably because I probably didn't have one. I think lack of clarity can come from someone who senses urgency but doesn't take a deep breath and describe where they're going. I think other people have a real sense of clarity. They know this is what the church should look like, this is what a church should feel like, but they have no urgency about it. Have you ever seen churches struggle for lack of urgency?
I think that there are a lot of pastors that have decent clarity about where they think their church should go, but they haven't done the hard spade work of trying to help their church share their urgency. And this is, Alan and I are both ordained in a tradition that has a very high view of preaching. So we spend a disproportionate amount of time as pastors preparing for preaching. We emphasize it, and both of us are convinced of its utility. We've seen the Lord use our own preaching in people's lives and in congregations in very profitable ways. So we're not down on that. But pastors a lot of times don't do maybe that part well by preaching in particular what would be helpful for their church to see the urgency of the situation. And then the rest of the work around leadership, leadership development, trying to do particularly devotions well in leadership meetings. And you're the leader, you set the conversation topics. What do you talk about when you sit down with people one-on-one, when you lead a small group, when you lead your small group leaders? That sort of the whole panoply of ways that you as a leader can help people catch an urgency from the scriptures for what
Mhm.
God calls us to. A lot of pastors just want to sort of declare it and do it and not do all of that hard work that it takes. And it does. It's hard work.
Yeah.
I was talking with a pastor last night, one of our coaches who ministers, just taken up a pastor in a more blue collar area, and we were talking about vision, and he was saying, yeah, if you were to try and communicate vision here, you would have to do it using different illustrations. And I'm like, that's important. And I remember from ministering a couple of times with blue collar folks that it's a lot more conversational than it is reading things. If you're in a more white collar area, you can hand somebody an article and you can trust
Mhm.
that they'll have read it and bring it back and talk about it. Um, but that's not typically the way that blue collar folks work, right? They're much more
Yeah.
conversational in their approach. That's costlier. It was frustrating to me as a pastor because I really just wanted to do it efficiently, hand them an article and come back and let's talk about it, right? But some of my leaders, that just wasn't the way that they lived life. Jesus wasn't upset at that. Was it more work for me? Yeah, it was. But I also needed to just swallow it and do that more work, because if I was going to lead them, I need to approach them in the way that they needed, not the way that I
Mhm.
preferred them to be.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's get to this third component then. Courage to lead change. I often talk about with people the difference between courage and bravado. Bravado is a lot of hard charging, chest thumping with a healthy dose of both arrogance and self doubt. um,
Perhaps an equal proportion depending on the day.
perhaps, perhaps in equal proportion depending on the day. Bravado is like trying to pretend you have courage when inside um, you are just trying to convince everyone you're okay. Courage, on the other hand, seems to be something more deeply seated in the soul than bravado. Um, Matt, when did you realize that you had a courage deficit when you were trying to lead change in a local church?
I think when I faced the consequences of not having the courage to move towards things that needed to be dealt with. Uh,
So there were problems, and you just could not. You ended up having consequences because you never moved toward the
yeah,
problems.
I'll give you two comparative illustrations. So one early in the ministry here in Seattle, we had a leader that was a very difficult person. He had a difficult run-in with most everybody in the church, including me. And and I knew that something needed to happen. I had another leader who was very conflict averse, and unfortunately, I let that other leader who was conflict averse be my counselor, and that counselor sort of, unwisely on my part, convinced me to not walk towards a conflict with a person that needed to happen,
Mhm.
because um, the way that this difficult leader was conducting themselves was disruptive. Right? It was problematic. Eventually, that that very difficult leader got frustrated enough with me with the way that things were going that they left. Um, but
Mhm.
in so leaving, it was very disruptive um, because um, because I hadn't faced it. Interestingly enough, years later, that conflict averse leader later became a difficulty and a problem. And that time, this is after sort of the courage revolution in my own life. Um, yeah, that leader engaged very patiently and thoughtfully with, was reading um, uh, Crucial Conversations at the time, rereading it, trying to make sure that had my head correctly around in the game. And yeah, that one, we lost the person, but it wasn't nearly as cataclysmic for the church or to me, because I knew that before the Lord, I had, I'd done what Paul did with Peter, which is he opposed, Paul opposed Peter to his face, right? Because he needed to be confronted. And I hadn't done that the first time, but the second time that I did, and well, I have no regrets about the way. Do I wish that the second gentleman had been able to stay at the church and find a different path? Yeah, I do wish they would, but I don't. I never wake up in the middle of the night and go, "Oh boy, I really wish I would have," or "I wish I wouldn't have." Nothing like that,
Yeah.
because it was engaged with courage.
Yeah.
Um, so in Courage, we recommend to people, I think Crucial Conversations, particularly because it has church examples in it, is very, very good. Um, Edwin Friedman's Failure of Nerve was absolutely life-changing for me, because it helped me realize, it helped me realize a whole lot of things that I hadn't realized. Um, but particularly that idea of the leaders being someone who stands outside of the system and addresses the system for its good, is not co-opted to the system, but is differentiated from it. And then later Pete Scazzaro and some of that as well.
Yeah.
So those are some of the influences for courage.
Yeah. Can you, for our audience, can you paint, can you draw a quick sketch? What does it look like? What does a pastor who is leading with courage look like versus a pastor who's leading with arrogance or bravado?
I think that a pastor who leads with arrogance or bravado basically tries to, they try and get something that many times is good-hearted done. Like they're not trying to do something. They're not trying to affect a conclusion, a result that's a bad thing. But the way that they've chosen to go about it, they have chosen to do it um, by bowling people over, or
Mm.
by being domineering, or by being, um, influential up to, like in the disc profile, like the high I, the influencer, being moving dangerously up towards political and manipulative, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of things. And when that's happened to you, and you look back, your reaction is, if you're somebody who that's happened to, you look back and you go, um, well, shoot, I was manipulated. I wasn't really appealed to or loved, or my viewpoint wasn't taken into account. I got hornswoggled. Anywhere from I got hornswoggled to I can't believe I let that happen. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, I think that the pastor's leading with courage, amazingly, plays it very straight. I think it's playing it straight for the long
Mm-hmm.
game, right? So if I think back to that first leader that I didn't confront, um, I didn't play it straight. I kind of just danced around the difficult situation. I didn't try and overly dominate the situation. I played the rest of the situation straight, which eventually led to the departure of the fellow. Um, but it would have been better for the whole system, um, frankly, if he would have changed and stayed. That's always my preference, because it's Jesus' preference. Jesus
Right.
is always after our change. So as pastors, our disposition always should be that we would prefer for people to change than leave. However, we can't leave them in a spot where they're damaging the body. So if they won't
Mm.
change, then yeah, they may need to leave. Um, it's interesting. I was in a conversation this week with a brother in a church where he's an elder, and he was placed in a difficult spot where he ended up in a meeting and he wasn't really sure what the meeting was about, and then the conduct of the meeting was very, very strange. And then only afterwards did he realize that it had been what felt like a very clever manipulation. Um, and I reviewed some of the materials at his request of, kind of around the meeting and what happened and things like that. And I was like, and I kind of walked away and I'm like, oh, that just felt icky.
Yeah.
And I think that when people lead with bravado or arrogance or they have to be right or it has to go this way, um, people walk away later and they just go, oh, that was icky, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where when you play it straight, that's not what it is. Somebody might walk away and go, well, I wish I wish that didn't have to be said to me, but at least it was said right to my face.
Yeah.
Right. And I think the person with courage, let's look at the New Testament again. It's all very straight. It's right at you. Paul refuses to manipulate. He refuses to exert his rights. He appeals to them based on Christ and their response to him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think always for us, lack of courage means that we don't appeal ever. Bravado means we try and bowl people over with our influence or our dominating or being dominating, right, with them, right? I think that courage is we come straight at them and we plead for them to follow Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that's the prophets, right? That we plead. Hey, it's Martha. Martha is our guest today on the podcast. Martha is Allan's beautiful daughter who's got pretty hair today. Hi, Martha. Did you want to be on the podcast today?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us.
Can you say hi, everybody?
Hi.
I don't know if this will make it into the final cut or not, but Martha's on the podcast. Well, Matt,
humanizes it.
It does. And that's the thing I probably need in life is to be humanized a little bit. So Matt, let's talk briefly. We've been talking about courage and leading change with courage, but not everybody who's interested in seeing the renewal of the local church is a leader in the local church. We've been talking about the importance of courage and leading change, Matt, but a lot of people interested in the topic of church renewal aren't leaders in their local church. They're in the pews and they just love and care about the local church. Give some encouragement to our listeners who are watching their pastor or their church leaders try to lead healthy change. What are some ways that they can be supportive, encourage? What are some ways that they can participate in leading change from where they sit?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that maybe a couple of things. One is just pray, right? I mean, change is always difficult. And we need the Holy Spirit to give us the willingness to choose to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? For the sake of Christ. So I think that prayer is one of the very best things you can do. I think that the second thing is be open to the scriptures. The change ought to be led because the scriptures point us in a certain direction, right? And so if people are willing to be led by the scriptures, that was one of the very best things about the church that I led here in Seattle is people were willing to be responsive to the scriptures. And that's what God calls all of us to do, right? Is to be responsive to him as he speaks to us in his word. I think the third thing is to be open to it being different, to being open to the form changing, even if the function stays the same. And that's the big thing. Most of the time, what happens in churches is not that people disagree necessarily about the function, but the form, and whether are we okay with the form changing, even if the function stays the same.
That's great. Well, thanks, Matt. We've got some great resources that are going to be linked in the podcast below that we've mentioned today, including John Cotter's Leading Change, Crucial Conversations. Was it Gary Ross's Turnaround Pastor?
Don Ross.
John Ross's Turnaround Pastor.
Don with a D.
Don, like my dad. Don Ross's Turnaround Pastor, and Friedman's Failure of Nerve. So listeners can check those out in the podcast. Yeah. We're wrapping up season 2 today, Matt, and we're getting into season 3. Can you believe we're not at 100 episodes. We're at 3,500 downloads. So that's cool. But knowing the way I download podcasts, that means we probably have about 5 listeners.
I think we might have a few more than that, at least from people that have talked to us, which is awesome. We're glad to be of benefit to you. And I realize that we didn't do a question and answer one in this season, but we love those. Those are fun to do. And so we will do some of those coming up as well.
Yeah. If you,
along with Martha's favorite brownie recipe.
That's right. Martha will be back to share which dinosaur she's pretending is under her bed tomorrow. So, Martha, is there a dino under your bed? Yeah, okay, great. Thanks for listening, folks, to the Church Renewal podcast. This podcast is a product of Flourish Coaching. You can find us online at flourishcoaching.org. Everett is a dino. Matt Bowling is our team leader and executive director. If you want to contact the Renewal podcast, we'd love to hear from you. So find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Flourish Coaching and the number 1. That's Flourish Coaching and the number 1. If you want us to keep creating free content in season 3 of our podcast and our blog, please visit flourishcoaching.org/give. That's flourishcoaching.org/give to support Flourish through the National Christian Foundation. All right, there's only one fully sufficient reason that this day dawned, and that is that Jesus is still gathering a people to himself and ordinarily using the church to do it. So join us next time and next season as we dig into the ways that Jesus is renewing his church.